Today we're going to talk about the development of the Spanish economy in the late 1500s, mostly from about the late 1540s into about the year 1600, maybe a little bit into the 1600s itself. So the big things we're going to talk about are really Spain's economic problems as they emerge out of the 1540s and the end of the kind of conquest era of the major kingdoms that they had encountered, and how their economy kind of sputters and then eventually fails in the colonies and in Iberia as well. And one of the main reasons for that is the failure of trade policies that become known as the fleet system. And to wrap up today, we'll talk about the beginning of the mass importation of African slaves in order to supplement and eventually take over the major manual labor workforce. Most of the original conquistadors who had gone out and conquered major parts of what would become the Spanish Empire, they largely wasted what they had won because they created these giant landholding properties, these giant encomiendas, and they mostly kind of sucked up as much wealth for themselves as they possibly could, and they did not reinvest their resources into the kind of systems or programs or infrastructure that would help the colonial society produce future wealth. So they did not build large amounts of schools to train future bureaucrats to have good government jobs, to make good salaries and spend. They did not build up their colonial infrastructure, road networks. They failed to just build up a lot of social programs that would be useful for further development in the economy further on. And they also did not invest their wealth into kind of future investments or businesses that would enhance their wealth or increase their wealth or the colonial colony's productivity. So they did not try to invest in machines or any type of industry or productive resources. They largely would try to buy more land or possibly invest in some gold or silver mines. So they made their colonial economies completely dependent on the labor system, the agricultural system, and eventually the gold and silver mines. So that meant that the entire economy became reliant on those few economic sectors. And if any of those sectors failed or even dipped in a noticeable way in prices or productivity, it could drag down the whole colonial economy. So after a while, farming agriculture itself slipped toward a kind of subsistence or even a barter system, because there wasn't a whole lot of new money, new investment floating around the colonial society. So they started buying and selling goods just with other goods instead of with money. And the gold and silver mines kept producing after a while, and they become really the focus of economic growth at really any level in the colonies, at least the Spanish colonies, by the late 1500s. They become a decent source of growth because it's not like the mines just kind of spit out silver and gold. You need to hire workers to go in there, and the workers require food, they require goods, they require tools, they require a lot of resources and the transportation systems to get those resources to the mines. So the mines had some kind of ripple effect on the entire economy, because the investment in the silver mines would spur other economic development in its wake or in its area. But a lot of the agricultural economy did not do that. So a lot of the Spanish colonial economy kind of stagnates and starts to fail after a while. The mines produce mostly gold at first, but by 1540 the mines will start to produce more silver in quantity and value than gold, again after about the 1540s. So the production of gold would have these kind of surprising new discoveries of a new gold mine somewhere, and so gold supply would increase very dramatically, and when that mine started to get depleted it would crash again, and so gold production went through these kind of boom and bust cycles very dramatically all the way into the 1800s. The mines that were established in New Spain, what would today become kind of central Mexico, started off using the encomienda labor model and then transitioned to the labor draft, the repartimiento, and then eventually the kind of wage labor system of non-slave labor. So technically free workers working for wages, but often would the miners would, or the mine owners would rely on debt peonage to keep the labor force kind of impoverished and subservient. So one big problem with the mines uh, is that the Spanish government relied so heavily on them for tax revenue. So if the agricultural sector failed, the only kind of good part of the economy that the government could tax were the mines themselves. So the government derived a lot of tax revenue directly from the mines, and so the government diverted a lot of resources to help support and develop and keep the mines running because the government felt it was a good investment because that's where the tax money was coming from. And of course, the more resources they poured into the mines, that means that there's less investment in the other sectors of the colonial economy. So the rest of the colonial economy suffers even if the mines are doing fairly well. And the most famous and most important silver mine in all of the Spanish territories is the Cerro Rico, literally the rich hill at Potosi in upper Peru. So in the Peruvian highlands of what is now today Bolivia. So the Cerro Rico is way up in the highlands. It's something like 16,000 feet up above sea level. So it is way, way up there. So the air is thin, and the mine work is obviously very labor intensive and very dangerous. So it's estimated that about 1 in 8 of the miners, the natives who went into that mine at that mountain, died in the mountain or died as a result of the work they were doing somehow. So this is extremely dangerous work, and they had to kind of rotate the miners in shifts month after month because they become so exhausted. But overall, the Spanish mining policies are a pretty big failure. They take a lot of gold and silver out of the mines, and they make a lot of money basically with that gold and silver. They kind of chop it up. What was taken out of the mines is chopped up and refined with mercury into coins or into gold or silver bars to be transported back to Spain. So they take a large quantity of gold and silver out of the mountain. The problem for the economy is that they didn't really reinvest a lot of that money that they were making into future systems that would build future economic growth. So the government and the investors are taking the money out for their own enjoyment or their own use, uh, and the money would not stay in the colonies. So the colonies are literally producing money out of the ground, but that money is being taken and transported back to Iberia, either as government tax revenue to be used in wars or whatever the government's spending money on, or just to go straight into the mine owners' pockets. So the investment in the rest of the colonial economy was pretty tiny and did not nearly meet the needs of what modern economists would say you should actually do with your wealth to try to build infrastructure or some types of social programs that will guarantee future wealth down through the decades. So their kind of money system, their mining system, failed to produce wealth or prosperity for the colonies. And many historians are very critical of the Spanish mining and taxation policies. They basically say that they took the money out and didn't increase the economy so that the economy could produce more goods and services. So they minted more money to chase the same amount of goods and services, which means basically inflation happens. The economy is pumping out just as many goods and services, but it's also pumping out much higher levels of money, so that means that prices go up. So if you want to buy a loaf of bread or something at the market, with that much more money pouring into society, one month maybe your loaf of bread is say $1, and 4 or 5 months later is $5 or $6, and the prices just keep going up and up to the point where your wages can't keep up, and there's a lot of social misery. And we'll start to see that as we start to look at the kind of colonial workforce in general and the amount of work they did and what kind of lives they lead. So most colonial workers worked long hours. Historians estimate that the average Spanish colonist worked a 12-hour day, 6 days a week, for wages that stagnated, especially in the late 1500s, and wages that did not keep up with the inflation. So you get this feeling, if you're a worker, that you're working every hour that you possibly can without dropping dead, and you're not able to save any money. You're not even very prosperous because all the money you make goes towards your immediate needs: food, clothing, housing. So there's this feeling that the colonists are being really taken advantage of, and there's a lot of anger out in the colonies that the economic system is working this way, and that the few mine owners or big landowners are getting very rich compared to the average workforce, who work an extreme amount of hours, and they're exhausted at the end of every day, and they're not getting ahead. They're actually barely surviving. So they're working long hours, and they can barely have enough food to eat. They're never able to save any money, and they felt much luckier than the workers who were unemployed or people who got sick, who either starved to death or migrated out of the colony if they could. So very few colonists worked the same job throughout the entire year. They would work one job during one type of season of the year, and they would transition to other jobs in order to try to keep money coming in somehow, or keep some kind of sustenance going. And even the best artisans in the cities, who tended to make the highest wages because they were producing tools and goods that were very useful for society, they may have the best wages, the best money coming in, but they usually also live in urban areas, the cities, where their cost of living is higher, and they're also running their own businesses, so their business expenses are higher. So even the artisans who charge high rates for their goods still are not making enough money to save and feel like they're prospering off of the colonial experience. So Spanish trade generally boomed. It did very well through the 1540s or so. Most historians argue that's because the conquest were still expanding the amount of territory that Spain was bringing under its control. So the Spanish conquistadors, the Spanish military, is still exploring around and conquering new native kingdoms. So there are more opportunities for trade. So that means more potential customers for one's goods. So you can try to sell goods at better prices. So it's a generally decent economy. And also, at the same time, the European interest in American-made goods, American-made products, is growing, and therefore the prices are growing. So European markets really enjoy purchasing and using cacao, indigo, medicinal plants that grow in the Americas. So that kind of interest in those prices really peak in the 1540s. And after about the year 1550, you start running into gigantic problems. Number one, the conquests tend to stop. So the Spanish military is not conquering any new native kingdoms. They're not opening new realms to Spanish trade. So they're not finding new markets for customers or for investment or resources or anything like that. So the economy starts to sputter when the conquests start to slow down after about 1550. And also the European interest in the American-made goods, it stays fairly stable. But the problem is that when there's trade between American-made goods and European-made goods, the Europeans can bring their goods into the American market for trade, but the mines don't yet produce enough wealth, enough literal money, to buy many imports from Europe that are moving into the colonies. So there's just not enough wealth in the colonial society to trade at good rates to buy European made products. So the Europeans see a really good opportunity to take European products into the American market and trade them and barter for a lot of American made goods. And they know that there's a good market to do that because there's so little money in the Americas that anyone who wants to buy European goods will have to give stuff instead of money. So it's a very restricted economy in that way. And the kind of European importers into the Americas really make a whole lot of money by trading their European-made goods, trading a few European-made goods for a whole lot of American-produced goods, and then taking those American-produced goods back to Europe and selling them at exorbitant prices. So again, the merchants are figuring out how to make the most money off of this economic system. And they will again be the kind of sectors of the economy that do the best in the kind of colonial era, or at least in the late 1500s and 1600s. And the Spanish government's not doing any better. They go into bankruptcy. Literally, the Spanish government declares bankruptcy and says it won't be able to repay its debts that it had taken on in 1557. So this is not just a problem of kind of Spanish businesses or colonial businesses. This goes all the way up to the top, all the way up to the monarchy, and it's the King of Spain in 1557 who has to declare bankruptcy in order to basically hit the reset button on Spain's credit system, the amount of money that the government could borrow through what we would today call national debt. So that bankruptcy, just like if you declare bankruptcy today, it harms your credit because now you're a credit risk. And the kind of creditors in Europe who lent governments money treated Spain the exact same after the Spanish bankruptcy. And they say, well, we have very little guarantee that if I lend you the government money now, that you have now set an example that you might not pay me back in the future. So the interest rates that creditors demand to give loans to the Spanish government, they raise those interest rates dramatically, and the Spanish government has a lot of financial problems even after the bankruptcy. So all of this adds up to a pretty dire economic system in the Americas, at least through the 1580s. So we're talking a good 30, 40 years of economic problems in the late 1500s. Trade-wise, there will be a little bit of a bump in the American economy, the colonial economy in the 1590s, especially because the silver and gold mines start producing some more silver and gold. They increase their quantity for export. So that will drive up their economy a little bit as more miners are hired that need more goods, buy more food, need more housing, and you get a kind of restart of economic growth, at least in the 1590s. Another source of economic growth that the Spanish colonies will start to find in the 1570s is they start to trade westward all the way across the Pacific Ocean in the 1570s, going all the way to the Philippines and China. So the Philippines are this island system just kind of southeast of China, where a lot of these arrows on the map are pointing directly toward. So they land basically in the Philippines, and then from there they will go to different ports in China or other ports in Southeast Asia. The Spanish government set that up because they have also colonized the Philippines, so that's a Spanish colony as well. So the Spanish government wanted to make sure that any boats going from the Americas, from the Spanish colonies in the Americas, would land in the Philippines first, so that the cargoes could be investigated and the taxes paid and whatnot before those cargoes could go on to other ports in East Asia. That trade grew very, very quickly because suddenly the kind of Pacific-facing major colonies in cities like Lima or Panama could now take their boats and go far west, and they encounter a massive market in East Asia. I mean, China already had one of the biggest populations in the world, So there's a lot of potential customers out there for these American-made goods. So trade with East Asia booms and grew so quickly that the Spanish government started fearing that it was getting out of control, and they start to restrict the trade in 1582, which is really pretty amazing. The one source of very large economic growth for the colonies, the government starts to shut it down in the 1580s, which is pretty extraordinary because the rest of the economy was really sputtering, and it had been struggling for several decades by that point. And the Spanish government is also afraid that if that trade continues, that a lot of the silver and gold being produced in Peru and Upper Peru and the mines in New Spain will start to kind of find its way out of the Spanish realms and instead get into these East Asian countries and possibly gobbled up by other European traders that are also trading in East Asia. So the Spanish government is starting to make some pretty questionable decisions, mostly out of a kind of paranoia that their European rivals are somehow going to take advantage of all this. And of course, they're kind of slowing down, and eventual almost complete shutdown of that trade with East Asia will do great damage to the rest of the colonial economies because it harms all other commodity sales because you just restricted the amount of customers they can have. So it does great damage to the whole colonial economy up and down the Spanish Empire in the Americas. And the Spanish tax plan really for the colonies is a short-term strategy. Spain's tax plan basically gathered enough revenue to pay for the colonies' government systems to keep going, their administrations to pay their employees and continue doing their jobs, and to pay a little bit for defense of the whole empire to hire soldiers and warships and whatnot. And any leftover money that the colonial taxes generated went straight to the Spanish treasury after 1550. And the Spanish government will rely on that yearly money, that tax revenue from the Americas coming in by the late 1550s. And some historians argue that American revenue was somewhere between 20 and 25% of all of Spain's tax revenue for a year. So the Spanish government is relying very heavily on the American taxes to fund whatever the government's doing. And in the late 1500s, it's generally a kind of foreign policies and foreign wars and whatnot. So that inspires the Spanish government to continue taxing the colonies at a high rate in order to keep getting that money for the Spanish government's own interests and its own goals. And another problem we start to see in the mid-1500s is just the decline of the Iberian cities themselves. So their own economies start to go downward. And historians argue that that's largely because wealth and economic innovation, business innovation, starts to move out of the Iberian Peninsula and starts to kind of get relocated in more northern European cities like Paris or London or some of the German cities. And that this was a disaster for the Spanish government because this starts to occur in the mid-1500s at the exact same time. American colonies that Spain owned required more capital, more money to invest to grow businesses, and started to require much more technologically skilled labor to fully develop their economy to guarantee some amount of prosperity into the future. So right when the colonies are ready for that infusion of cash and talent, that cash and talent starts to leave Iberia and goes to be invested in other parts of Europe. So it's really a double whammy even for the colonies. And the Spanish government tried to stop that decline by, again, taxing its colonies even more heavily by raising the tax rates and regulating the amount of goods that could be produced in the colonies. Because a lot of the goods that are made in the colonies are exported back to Spain. So if the colonies are producing goods more efficiently or more cheaply than similar goods that are made in Spain itself, that means that when buyers go to a market and they see two of the very similar product, one made in the Americas much more cheaply and one made in Spain more expensively, that means that the American made good can probably lower its prices because its business was more efficient and therefore compete with the kind of homemade goods in Spain. And a lot of the, Spanish landowners and Spanish business owners complain about that quite a lot to the Spanish government, saying that you should restrict the amount of goods produced in the Americas because they're too competitive with us and they're driving us, the Spanish producers, out of business. So the government responded to those demands and started regulating which goods are produced in the colonies and in what quantities, or what quantities at least could be exported back to Spain. So that does a lot of damage also to the colonial economic development. And Spanish tax policies, again, are just draining money out of the colonies in very, very large amounts. So it's just draining wealth from areas that in the Americas that need that wealth to invest in future businesses or future innovations to grow their economy. And the Spanish thought this was a completely acceptable system because their government argues that, hey, this is colonization. The whole point of colonization is to enrich the home country. It's not to enrich the colonists. The colonists are basically government employees that are sent out there, and they're to work, and they can make a little money for themselves, but their general purpose is to bring money and goods back into the home country to enrich it. That's the whole kind of government theory of why they're colonizing in the first place. So the Iberian government, Spain and Portugal, largely ran their colonies for the profit of the home countries, for the kind of mercantilist idea of keeping a favorable balance of trade, which means that you're making more money off these colonies than you're spending to kind of for their upkeep. So the colonies are almost chronically short of money for investment that would create a kind of self-perpetuating economic growth for the long term. And they're almost always chronically short of that money because the money is always being taken out of the colonies on a pretty constant basis. So anyone who would think to invest or lend money to an investment scheme in the colonies, they were very cautious, and they tended mostly to lend money to proven economic ideas that would make more money, which basically means that the investors, the few that existed or were willing to invest in the American colonies, tended to mostly want to invest in agriculture, in buying more land to produce more farm goods to make money, because that's the agricultural system that's been used forever in the European Middle Ages, the idea that land produces wealth. Or they would invest in the mines, because the mines were some of the most profitable sections of the colonial economy. So a lot of the investors saw almost anything else as a big risk. And investors, they look to maximize profit and minimize risk. So the few innovative companies that are getting going in the American colonies, they find it very difficult to attract investment capital, and they often have to use their lands or their buildings or something like that as collateral to get that investment. And of course, the Spanish government bankruptcy in 1557 didn't help anything either. It did great damage to the economy overall. And one thing to remember about the American colonial system, just where the colonies were, is that the American terrain is often very difficult and limited economic growth all by itself. The big gold and silver mines were often separated from the market or population centers. The population centers were separated from each other by rough terrain, forests, mountains, even deserts in some places, and there were very few navigable rivers to put goods or people on to move them around back and forth between the population centers. And the best areas for kind of shipping goods back and forth were obviously along the coastlines, and several of the big cities are on the other side of the coast. They're on the Pacific side. So they find it very difficult to transport goods all the way around the southern tip of South America to get to just the Atlantic side of, say, Mexico, or of the kind of northern coastline of South America. So if you want to transport goods, the kind of most reliable way to do that is to move them overland from the Pacific coast to the Atlantic coast, which is very dangerous. It is very difficult. The roads are not very well kept. And the transportation costs just skyrocketed, because as you're traveling through, you should probably hire some bodyguards and whatnot to make sure that your goods aren't stolen as they're being moved across. So just the transport cost dragged down the colonial economy as well. And of course, the Spanish bankruptcy in 1557 did no good at all to not just the Spanish economy, but the American colonial economy. The big result of that is that once the government declares bankruptcy, it's immediately looking for any kind of revenue stream it possibly can. And this is what convinces the Spanish government to start selling a lot of offices in the colonial administrations to really anyone who has some money to buy with. So the government's looking for a revenue stream, and they start using offices and even increasing the amounts of offices that exist just in order to sell them, which makes kind of colonial governance even less efficient than it was before, and often more corrupt than it was before. So this heavily corrupted a lot of colonial governments, and of course the local elites, the ones who have the money and are looking to get their friends or family members into government, they'll buy those offices because they want to corrupt the government so that they can get away with smuggling or tax evasion or other kind of illicit or criminal acts that they don't want the government to come after them for. So they put their friends in government just by buying them offices in order to have insiders in the government to help them get away with these types of crimes. And then in 1604, after a new king takes over, the Spanish pass a law saying that present office holders and future office holders could pass their position on to their heirs, the next generation in their family, if they, again, paid a special fee to be allowed to do that. So again, the government is looking for any revenue source they possibly can, and this is really the rich and powerful getting more rich and powerful. So the government in the early 1600s tried to resist selling the offices to anyone who could afford to buy them, but they slowly start to give in, and it starts in the early 1600s. One of the big changes is 1604, when they allow those offices to be passed on to the heirs in the family. But it keeps going and getting worse and worse for the next 100 years or so. The monarchy, the Spanish crown, tried to resist selling the highest positions, the most important positions in the colonies, especially that they directly depended on to actually run the governments at the highest level. But they even start doing that. So they, for example, they start selling the office of treasurer in 1633. So that's the person who oversees the entire colonial treasury, the colonial government funding, basically, and who audits the government and whatnot. So it's probably not good to have a kind of bribed person or a lot of favoritism running that job. A lot of the provisional or provincial administrators, those offices start to get sold in the 1670s. And the leaders of the audiencias will start to be sold in the late 1680s. So the regional kind of heads of the administration, those offices will be bought by 1687, and even the viceroys themselves, the highest level of government in the American colonies, will go up for sale in the early 1700s. So this promotes a kind of epidemic corruption and epidemic even embezzlement. So the Spanish colonial governance just grows worse and worse through this type of corruption down through the decades, and will hit kind of its worst point in around the year 1750 or so, the mid 1700s. Okay, next section is to talk specifically about the import and export system that Spain used, which comes to be known as the fleet system. So the big reason that the Spanish start to develop this fleet system, which is basically a convoy, is because a lot of the gold ships and silver ships that were literally taking the gold and silver from the mines out of the colonies and transporting it back across the oceans to Spain, those start getting attacked by pirates, or basically pirates under rival government employment who worked for, say, England or France or the Dutch or someone like that. These kind of pirates start attacking these gold ships going back and forth because they're kind of like sitting ducks. So the Spanish government is very angry about that, and they're losing a lot of money. So they developed this thing called the fleet system, which starts off as really a convoy to bring traders, and especially those treasure fleets, back and forth across the ocean. So the convoy is really a bunch of armed ships of the Spanish Navy that are guarding the treasure fleets as they go back across the Atlantic Ocean back to Spain. So that system is pretty fully in place by the 1550s. And that kind of leads to a convoy-type import-export system in general that goes beyond just the treasure fleets. So by the 1550s, the general system that emerged was a yearly convoy of ships that would leave Spain and go to specific places. So one fleet would leave from Spain in about May and go to New Spain, which is today Mexico, and they will probably arrive there in about a month or two. Another convoy would leave from Spain to go to Peru and Panama. So that convoy would leave in August and probably again arrive in a month or two. And they would only go to those places, their designated stopping points, and they would bring European-made goods, and they would bring businessmen and traders and whatnot, and they would hold trade fairs at the harbors where they landed in Mexico, New Spain, or Peru and Panama. So this would be the kind of 1 or 2 weeks of the year where the convoy would arrive, and there would be open trade between American-made goods and European-made goods. And of course, businessmen were there, merchants, and they had different currencies and whatnot. So they're making deals like crazy. So these trade fairs at the harbors were big, big, big deals because this is the one instance that they could get these specific kind of goods back and forth. And once the trade fairs ended, once the trading kind of died down and all the business was done, the convoys from all different of these, these two convoys would basically leave the harbors where they were assigned to land, and they would go to Havana in Cuba, and the two convoys would both meet there, and then they would return to Spain. And of course, the government would demand tax revenue from all these trading and all this interaction, these trade fairs. And the tax revenue was intended to pay for the cost of sending the fleet in the first place, and also to give the government some amount of profit out of this system. There are several problems with the system, though. Number one is that the fleet system convinced and motivated many of the traders to cheat in every way they could possibly think of. So a lot of the traders that are leaving from Spain and going toward the colonies and landing, they would uh, they would bribe the official government inspectors, um, so that the inspectors would look the other way when they're supposed to be inspecting the cargo that's making it onto the boats to go to the Americas. A lot of the cargo was intentionally mislabeled, and if you bribe the government inspector, they're not going to investigate the mislabeled package very much. They're just going to check it off on the list and say it's all right. There is intentional undercounting of goods, so that the company or the trader or the merchant would write down, I have 20 of whatever, this piece of cloth from Italy that I'm trying to sell or something like that, whereas they might actually have 100 of it, and then they would give the government inspector a small bribe to let them get away with it, so that when they sold that in the colonies, they can sell 100 of them and only write it up as 20, so they'd only pay tax on the 20. So this became such an epidemic of cheating within the fleet system that it was kind of an open joke in Spain that this was going on, and in the colonies. They knew what was happening too. So it makes a mockery of the government's ability to enforce its own laws. So the whole thing largely becomes a joke. And the fleet system does a lot of damage to the colonial economy in two very specific ways. The first is that it allows rich merchants and merchant companies to monopolize the goods that are making their way into the American market. And it allows the American-based merchants to go in with their large amounts of money. The big trading businesses. They would go down to the harbor for these trade fairs, and if there's goods that they thought would be really profitable in the colony for the next year or so until the next fleet comes in, that trading company would go in and just buy up all of those resources. They would buy up every single one, or at least as much as they could get their hands on. And so these very wealthy companies would basically monopolize the market for those goods. And once they've bought up all the goods, and there's no more coming in for another year, what those companies would do is bring those goods into some kind of storehouse, and they would restrict the market for sale of those goods in the colonies for the next year, because again, there's not another fleet coming in for another year. So once these companies have bought up all the Italian cloth or whatever that's going to be sold in that colony for a full year, they're not going to take it all to market at the same time, because if you sell it all at the same time, that reduces the price, because buyers have a lot of options to buy. So if you buy 100 pieces of Italian cloth as a monopolist, you store 90 of them in your warehouse for the first month after the fleet leaves. And the first month, you only bring 10 of those cloths out for sale. And there might be hundreds of colonists that want to buy it. So if there's only 10 of them for sale this month, that drives up the price. And once you sell all those 10 for your higher price, your inflated price, the next month you bring another 10 out from the warehouse and sell those for an inflated price. So in effect, what the fleet system does is allow rich merchant companies in the Americas to monopolize and corner the market for those goods and sell them at inflated prices. So again, the merchants are making the biggest amount of profit off the fleet system and the kind of colonial to European trade contacts. Another way this harmed the colonial economy is that the colonies could not trade with other buyers from other countries. So it restricts the trade. It restricts the amount of European customers that the colonies could have, which tends to keep the export prices of those goods low, because the Europeans coming to the colonies know that if the colonists don't sell their goods to these Europeans these couple weeks, they're not going to be sold at all. So the Europeans come in and they basically lowball the prices. So it's a very restricted customer base, which again harms colonial producers because they can't get very high prices for their goods. And so the European traders, they might buy those American-made goods for very cheap and then bring them back to Europe where who knows what the price is, maybe it's much higher, and they sell it for a massive profit. So again, the big merchant trading companies are making a lot of money if they can corner the markets in this way. And on the other side of all this, the fleet system also does a lot of harm to the Iberian economy and especially the Spanish economy. First, like we've been talking about, it allows the kind of big invested, big capitalized merchant companies and the kind of investment speculators for all these goods to basically suck up all the profit on these trade, which of course harms Spanish industries, because anyone who wants to make money in business in Spain is going to start investing in these merchant companies, which causes a kind of investment crunch, a credit crunch for any Spanish company that has an innovative idea about how to build a business and get it to grow and get some innovation going in the Spanish economy. Most of the investment money is going to the merchants because they're churning out massive profits because they're taking advantage of all this restricted trade. So that harms all of the Spanish economy in general. And of course, this also harms Spain's total exports to the rest of the world, and especially to the Americas, because they can only send so many boats during that once yearly fleet. And the people that the Spanish government or the traders hired to bring Spanish-made goods to the Americas, they're getting bribed also, and especially the government officials are supposed to be keeping watch over all this. And a lot of this bribery is happening from foreign merchants. So the French merchants that were desperately trying to break into these Spanish markets in the colonies, they'll bribe Spanish government officials to load up a bunch of crates full of French-made goods and just label it as Spanish-made goods, and they'll give a bribe to the government guy who's supposed to be watching all this. So historians estimate that by the year 1700, that only about 1 in 8 of all goods that went through the fleet system was actually made in Spain. So 7/8 of the goods that are making the journey across under the official Spanish government's watchful eye, only maybe 1 in 8 is actually made in Spain, and 7/8 of that stuff is made in other European countries. So this whole bribery system is a disaster for the Spanish government and for the Spanish economy in general. So historians often argue that the fleet system was very successful at getting gold and silver to Spain from the American colonies, that the convoy system was very useful for guarding the treasure fleets as they made their way across the Atlantic Ocean back towards Spain, but that the fleet system as a general economic strategy failed in almost every way possible. And the fleet system, it arrives on a yearly basis according to schedule every year through about the 1580s or so. And by the late 1580s, you're starting to see problems. And the fleet system doesn't arrive every year in the colonies by the late 1580s. That could largely be because this is when the Spanish Armada is getting going, so the Spanish government is trying to get every boat that sails to put some cannon on it to try to invade England. So that might be a cause. But by the 1620s, it's not just every once in a while the fleet doesn't show up for the year. Some of these gaps in the fleet arrivals could go several years by the 1620s. And then it's only about once every 4 or 5 years that the fleet system shows up in the colonies by about the mid 1600s, so around 1650 or so. So that restricts trade and does even more economic damage down through the decades going into the 1600s. It's really pretty disastrous. And a lot of this is caused by the intervention of foreign rivals that are trying to break into the colonial trade and colonization in general, especially in the late 1500s and getting into the 1600s. So Spain's internal economic problems had a lot to do with this, but also the introduction of foreign competition really into the system. And one interesting thing about all this is that Portugal took the exact opposite strategy for its colonies in Brazil. Number one, it let ships unload at many different ports in a fairly unrestricted way. So they do the exact opposite of the Spanish fleet system. They allow boats from many different areas to unload and have trade in many different areas along the Brazilian coastline. So it's a fairly unrestricted growth in trade in Brazil, which stimulates a lot of the Brazilian economy because the Brazilian producers have a lot of customers they can sell to, so that drives up prices. And so investment in Brazilian production or Brazilian businesses grows because they know they have a lot of customers out there that they can make money off of. So the Portuguese government really allows pretty much unrestricted economic growth to keep going in Brazil as much as they can get it. The only time that the Portuguese government will use official convoys to protect ships going back and forth is when the piracy problem got really bad, when pirates started attacking a lot of ships. And really, that's really even pretty rare that the Portuguese government will send convoys. They will mostly try to instead rely on just sending the goods through faster ships that can outrun the pirate ships. And eventually they will even hire French or British shippers, French or British merchants, or even warships, kind of private warships, like mercenary ships, to cross the Atlantic with some Portuguese ships to protect them or to even carry the goods themselves. So the Brazilian economy is much more open to international commerce and open to the involvement of even foreign merchants and foreign traders and foreign mercenaries. And that system seems to work a whole lot better. So there is some more government restriction over Brazilian trade starting around the 1640s, and that's largely because the Dutch will start attacking the Portuguese shipping going to Brazil back and forth as the Dutch start to empower themselves and they start to make themselves or try to make themselves into a major rival, a real colonial power in the Americas. So there will be some more Portuguese government restrictions on trade in order to try to protect the shipping going back and forth once the Dutch start to kind of be a big nuisance. But again, Portugal's major trade focus was not even in Brazil in the first place. They're much more interested still in sailing their ships around South America and going to India, or even going on into what they will start to call the East Indies, kind of the islands south of Southeast Asia. So around what we previously saw in this lecture with the map with the Philippines, there's a bunch of islands just off of Southeast Asia, and the Dutch will start colonizing those, and the Portuguese will start colonizing those, and even the French will get in there eventually. So Portugal's main focus is on that area for trade, really, what at the time they called the East Indies, whereas the Caribbean and the Americas is often referred to as the West Indies. So the Portuguese government doesn't really demand a whole lot of oversight over the Brazilian economy or Brazilian trade until about the mid-1600s or so. And the last section we're going to cover today is to talk much more in depth about the existence of African slavery and as it starts to grow into the late 1500s in both the Spanish and the Portuguese colony. So again, we've talked about before how slavery was pretty marginal in Western Europe, especially African slavery, the capture of Africans and bringing them into Western Europe to enslave them. It existed, but not on a very large scale by the mid 1400s. But the Iberians start importing a lot more African slaves in the late 1400s, especially in the 1490s. So Portugal and Spain, as they start to import more and more Africans, maybe a few hundred per year in the later 1400s, they'll sign a treaty called the Treaty of Alcacovas that denies Spain the power to import African slaves. So Spain was really kicked out of the African slave trade. So if Spain is going to import African slaves, they'll have to sign contracts with Portuguese traders to get the slaves from Africa and bring them to where the Spanish government or Spanish traders want them to go. And again, most early Latin American colonial economies were built on the encomienda system that required pretty little capital investment, as mostly, conquistadors or something that are laying claim to the land and basically enslaving the natives or forcing them into some kind of labor force agreement that tended to, over time, basically turn into native slavery. The first Spanish and Portuguese colonies will actually rely on native slavery, the enslavement of Native Americans, much, much more as the general labor source. And the African slaves will only start to replace them when the native slaves just start dying off in mass numbers, and it doesn't really slow down very much, probably because of European diseases. So the Caribbean islands started growing sugar, and Brazil starts growing sugar in the 1520s. But its profitability in Brazil starts to grow by the 1530s, and they start importing some African slaves to use as the labor force to grow sugar. But in Brazil and the Caribbean, the big sugar boom starts to happen in the 1550s, and that's when they start to import massive amounts of African slaves into those areas to work in the sugar fields. And historians today estimate that the mass majority of slaves that will be imported from Africa into the Americas go directly into the sugar-producing regions. So you can see on this map it says that about 40% of all slaves taken out of Africa go directly into the Caribbean islands. The big sugar plantations on places like Hispaniola, Cuba, even Puerto Rico, and 38% of all African slaves, so nearly the same amount, go straight into Brazil, into the sugar plantations. And again, this really starts to ramp up in the 1540s, 1550s. And amazingly, a lot of students in the United States know about slavery and they know how horrible it was, and that seemed to be everywhere in the United States. Really a very small fraction of all the Africans that were enslaved were brought into what eventually becomes the United States. So only about 6%. So that shows you the scale of African slavery that is going into the Spanish Empire, the Caribbean, and Brazil. Many, many times, at least 10 times as many, probably about 15 times as many slaves are brought into those areas than are brought into the eventual United States. And especially in Brazil, when the sugar plantations start to grow and become massively profitable, a lot of those plantations will hire mercenaries to go out and capture new slaves or purchase slaves from Native Americans in the interior who went to war with their enemy tribes to gather prisoners in order to sell as slaves to the Brazilian colonist and sugar plantation owners. So Portuguese enslavers will move into the interior of the Americas, further west from the Brazilian coastline, further into Brazil, and bring back toward the coastline to make into to major slaves. So African slavery emerges as the major labor source for the sugar plantations, at least by the 1570s, possibly a little bit earlier. And it really completely replaced native slavery, at least in the sugar plantations, by the early 1600s. So relatively few Native Americans will work in the sugar plantations by then. Some of the interior farmlands away from the coastline will still use a lot of native slavery, even after the 1600s. So Brazil imported the most African slaves at first because it was the first big colony to start producing sugar in a majority of its economy, to really center its economy on sugar production. And also because if you just look at the map, Brazil, just as a coastline, is much closer to West Africa, which reduced transportation costs for bringing slaves in. And it's absolutely shocking to realize that about as many Africans died in Africa in the wars to gather prisoners to sell into slavery, and died either in Africa as a result of those wars, or died in transport from Africa to the Americas, as would be actually enslaved in the Americas. So the amount of Africans that are actually enslaved and work in the plantations or do whatever in the Americas is only half of the amount that were enslaved in Africa in the first place. So we're talking about millions of people. So the introduction or the use of African slavery is just absolutely catastrophic for Western Africa. And the daily work regimen is absolutely horrific, especially in the Americas and in the sugar fields. So about half of all slaves, African slaves in the Americas, worked in the sugar fields in Brazil or Hispaniola or Cuba. So most Brazilian sugar plantations will have about 600 to or 60 to 100 African slaves working on an individual sugar plantation by the early 1600s. And that's somewhat reminiscent or very similar to the kind of statistics for the amount of slaves that would work on a plantation in the southern United States in the 1800s. But the Caribbean islands, the sugar islands, would employ vastly larger numbers, about 10 times as many slaves per plantation by the 1700s. So each plantation that produced sugar in the Caribbean islands would employ somewhere between 500 and 1,000 slaves per plantation. So this is absolutely massive and horrific, and would only grow, especially in Cuba, after its big boom in sugar production started in the 1790s. So the treatment of slaves in the sugar plantations and elsewhere was pretty horrific. In the sugar plantations, slaves often went hungry at the end of the long work day. They were only given one set of cloth, generally, to make clothes out of for one entire year. The Brazilian government realized that these working conditions were absolutely horrific and that a lot of slaves were dying because of it. So the Brazilian colonial governments tried to pass legislation, tried to pass new laws that required specific amounts of food rations for slaves on a daily basis, would require better living conditions and more clothes and whatnot. But the plantation owners just refused to enforce it, and the directors of the different colonial kind of regional governments refused to enforce it too. So it's again, you have this situation where you have laws on the books, but if the government officials in the localities just refuse to enforce it, it's like the laws don't even really exist. If no one's being punished for breaking the laws, it's like it's a free-for-all. Everyone does what they want. So slaves could get married and start families, if they lived in the same place. So in Brazil, especially, the landowners liked that because slave marriages would produce children. So that would produce a future generation of slaves. And it's natural procreation. So there's a certain amount of gender balance amongst the African slaves, at least by the 1700s. And Brazilian slaves, if they were married, they could refuse to be sold because if they were sold, their marriage would be broken up. So Brazil could allow slaves to refuse to be sold to other areas without their spouse following them, but they had no power to stop sales of their children. So slaves were heavily mistreated and families were broken up, but in Brazil they had some recourse to stop marriages from being broken up. A lot of slaves rebelled against their enslavement in any way that they could think of. And the most common ways for them to do so was to work as slow as possible, to get back at the landowner or the enslavers, to try to drive down their profits. Because the harder the slaves worked, they knew they're not getting anything out of this work. It's all going to be back-breaking labor. So the harder they worked just meant more profit to the slave owner. And they knew that, so they would try to slow down the work process as much as they could. They often intentionally broke their tools to, again, slow down the scale of the work and the speed of the work. Sometimes they would intentionally try to kill livestock in order to harm the owner's profit. And a lot of this kind of anger amongst the slave owners, they realize what's going on. They try to get the slaves to work as fast as possible. And the slave owners will define slaves as kind of lazy, and you have to really push them to work hard. And a lot of those kind of social definitions of the darker skinned peoples who don't really want to work and they just want to lounge around all day, that kind of racist interpretation still comes down to us today. And a lot of it comes from just the slave attempts at some type of rebellion against the people that were forcing them to work. So the slaves were trying to break the labor cycle as best they could, or at least slow it down as much as they could. A lot of slaves would try to run away and get into the interior. Few even did escape and got into the interior away from the coastline and tried to create free African communities that the Portuguese would call quilombos and the Spanish would call the palenques. So the slaves sometimes were able to escape, and they would contact each other and form these African communities that hated slavery, and they would fight back and fight off any kind of slave traders that came to try to find them and kidnap them. But that is fairly rare. It's not widespread. The idea of it is definitely widespread, but they're not always successful in doing so. And since Spain would develop its sugar economies a little bit later than Brazil in a lot of instances, a lot of the African slaves in Spanish America lived in urban cities or worked in households doing domestic chores or something like that. So not a good large amount of African slaves never worked in the sugar fields in the Americas. And historians estimate that somewhere around 10 to 25% of the populations of all the big colonial cities were actually African slaves or their free descendants. And even in the tropics, in the Caribbean, a large amount of the slaves living in these urban settings in these cities were kind of domestic slaves that did chores around the house or something like that and did not work in the sugar fields. And if a slave was relatively fortunate enough to only have to work in the household, the households would often only employ 1 or 3 or 4 slaves, so it wasn't like hundreds and hundreds in a household, unless it was a gigantic mansion or something like that. So that made the slaves' lives much more kind of close and intimate with the owners, rather than the slaves on the sugar plantations, who might only actually see the owner, once a month or something like that, because the owner stays in the house, doesn't want to go out to where the work is being done. A lot of Spanish and Portuguese laws allowed slaves to make extra money on the side or on days off or something like that. And if they could save up enough money, they could buy their freedom from their owners. So slaves, if they're able to save some money, would try to negotiate with their owners about basically a price for freedom, a monetary price in money. And slaves could complain to the local court system if their owner refused to set a price or set an unreasonable price that they know the slave could never meet. So they could start a kind of court system or a lawsuit to force the court to appeal to the court to set a reasonable price for buying freedom. And again, just like the escape idea, relatively few were able to buy their freedom, but the idea was out there, and it was a theoretical possibility. And it was much more likely that a slave working in a household would be able to make extra money, or working in an urban setting would be able to work for wages for some other company in the city on their day off, to save money to buy their freedom. And it is much less likely that slaves on plantations or sugar fields or something like that would be able to save any money at all, because they're almost always just working out in the fields, and they don't have access to other owners or other businesses that might be willing to hire them and pay them. And actually, one of the biggest slave owners in all the Americas is the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church owned a whole lot of farmland. They've invested in a lot of different businesses, and especially the Jesuit order particularly owned many slaves to run their farms and their properties, and even had slaves run their commercial investments. Jesuits and other Catholic groups, Catholic denominations, got into the kind of commodity investment business. They would also buy up goods that were traded or imported and sell them on the open market for more money. And a lot of these church-based organizations would have slaves run those businesses, or do the actual trading, or transport the goods back and forth, or something like that. So the church often proclaimed its desire to help protect slaves or offer salvation to the slaves. But the church was also known to punish slaves who did not follow orders. And that's even beyond the kind of punishment or the crime of merely owning them as slaves in the first place. There is some amount of Brazilian industry starting to get off the ground in the late 1500s. And the most famous instance of that were the Brazilian engenhos, which are basically sugar refiners who ran a kind of small sugar mill on the plantation site, who you could see by the image was mostly kind of human or animal kind of muscle labor that would turn the turret that would make the machine run so that they could refine the sugar. And this was a pretty good deal, because not every plantation had one of these engenhos. So, one plantation in the area, in the locality, would have the engenho, and they would sign deals with the neighboring plantations who didn't have one of their own to also refine their neighbor's sugar, often for a fee or a price, which was often about half of the sugar that was refined. So this helped everyone involved. It helped the engenhos because they had more customers, they had more work to do, because they were refining the sugar of several plantations day in and day out. It helped the lavradores, the small landowners who might be in debt, or might be renting their land or working for a bigger landowner, who could still grow their sugar and harvest the sugar without having to buy their own mill, their own engine itself. So they could just transport the raw sugar to wherever that mill is and have it done there. And it also gave a kind of market protection to both sides in case of a bad harvest and in case prices would start to go up. So this is what economists today call economies of scale. It was a way of scaling up the production process without forcing every single producer to have one of these mills and invest in one of these mills, because that might slow down the investment. But sugar production depended on a couple pretty obvious variables. Number one, it was almost completely dependent on African slavery, or slavery of some kind, at least Native American slavery in the mid-1500s, and then replaced by African slavery mostly after that, by the late 1500s, early 1600s. And that meant that the price of sugar was very dependent on the price of slaves at market. How much could you buy a slave for to do this work would determine how much investment costs went into your sugar production, which would determine how much you had to sell your sugar for at the market, at the end point, to make profit. And we also have to remember that sugar is a perishable good, especially back then. The sugar had to be harvested, it had to be refined and transported and sold fairly quickly before the sugar went bad or got stale, because the owners did not want to invest in the cost of trying to store the sugar, because storage could spoil it and could bankrupt the plantation owner. So the sugar prices will kind of ebb and flow. They will vary over time, and depending on all those different kind of market variables, sugar production could be a pretty risky business. So that's just one more example of some of the economic struggles that several of these colonies will go through by the early 1600s. So we'll stop here for today, and next time we'll talk about other threats to the colonial economies in the 1500s going into the kind of early 1600s, which is the introduction of foreign rivals outside of Iberia, largely the French, the English, and the Dutch, trying to get involved in colonization and also hiring pirates to go off and attack a lot of these colonies, or the convoys or the trading ships going back and forth across the Atlantic. So we'll get into the kind of sources of colonial competition from other major powers in the next lecture.